Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. I am this morning's worship associate. Our church is a place where you are free to be you. So bring your questioning mind, your expansive heart, your entire self to this beloved community. Our mission is to welcome all with love, to support learning and spiritual growth, to serve our wider community, and to work for justice, equity, and inclusion. We remember that we live and worship on a land that was once the home of the ancient mound builders and the Mayamia and the Shawnee people. I have a few announcements. Make sure you read your bulletin and the inserts today, where you will find important information regarding accommodations and upcoming events. Jan Conley has reminded me that our next phase of First Church refresh and deep cleaning will be centering on the kitchen today after the congregational meeting. Also, please remember we are having a congregational meeting. So after that, take home anything that you have in the refrigerator or the freezer so that we can get everything cleaned. Also want to call attention in the bulletin that the October potluck has been changed. It will now take place on October 27th. And this, again, it has to do with the deep cleaning of the kitchen. The flowers today are given by Mary Mark in celebration of the September birthdays. And now we come to the part of greeting our neighbors. So before we do that, please take a moment. And we're gonna wave to our members and friends at home as soon as we get the picture changed. There we go. Okay, and then rise and greet our neighbors or say hello in the chat. And when you hear the singing bowl, please return. And now, Chloe, will you please come forward as we prepare to light the chalice? We light this flame to remind us, love is the center. As we grow and connect with each other, mature and deepen our covenant, love remains the center. When the light of truth burns all else away, love remains. May it be so. And our first hymn this morning is number 73 in the gray hymnal, Chant for the Seasons. Please rise in body or spirit.
Pride, the story of Harvey Milk and the Rainbow Flag, written by Rob Sanders, illustrated by Stephen Salerno. You have to give them hope. Hope for a better world. Hope for a better tomorrow. Harvey Milk was an ordinary man. but he had an extraordinary dream. That dream would change history. Harvey dreamed that everyone, even gay people, would have equality. He dreamed that he and his friends would be treated like everyone else. He dreamed that one day, people would be able to live and love as they pleased. With his New York accent, Harvey talked to everyone about his dream. His voice boomed. His body bounced with energy and excitement. Some people listened. A few people agreed. Most did not. But Harvey's big voice and his big dream wouldn't be stopped. He discovered that the best way to change laws was to help make laws. In 1977, Harvey Milk took a big step toward that dream when he became one of the first openly gay people to be elected to political office in the United States. Harvey and his friends planned marches to protest inequality and unfair laws. And just days before one of those marches, Harvey had an idea. A symbol, he thought. We need a symbol that shows who we are and how we feel. Something to carry during the march. Something to make people feel they're part of a community. Something to give people hope. Something extraordinary. Harvey knew an artist who could help, Gilbert Baker. Harvey asked. Gilbert said, "We need a flag." Volunteers arrived to help Gilbert's design come to life. Together, they dipped fabric into large barrels filled with vivid, vibrant dyes. They cut and pieced and sewed until Harvey, Gilbert, and the other activists had a flag with 8 colorful stripes, a flag that Harvey hoped would give hope. Rights are won only by those who make their voices heard. On June 25, 1978, when it was time for the march, a breeze stirred in San Francisco. The flag unfurled. The wind blew. The flag fluttered, flapped, and flew. A rainbow as bright and unique as the men and women who walked behind it led the march. Harvey and the people asked for equality. They asked to be treated like everyone else. They asked to live and love as they pleased. They hoped the march would make a difference. Harvey was proud of the flag and proud of himself. He hoped others would be proud too. 5 months later, on the morning of November 27, 1978, Harvey and the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, were assassinated. Their lives were taken by a man who did not think like Harvey, or feel like him, or love like him. The flag did not fly on that dark, sad night. Instead, thousands and thousands of people marched silently, carrying candles. The candlelight wove through the streets of San Francisco, up and down hills and around city buildings, a mile of glowing candlelight in honor of 2 lives lost. That could have been the end of Harvey's dream and the colorful flag, but it wasn't. More rainbow flags were created. Some of the colors changed. 8 stripes became 6 stripes. But the meaning of the flag did not change. It was a flag of equality. More and more people began to think of the flag as their flag, and they began to feel pride. They began to feel hope. In 1994, Gilbert Baker designed another rainbow flag. This one was larger than all the rest. Women and men side by side carried the flag, a proud mile-long rainbow floating through New York City. The flag wove through the streets, up and down avenues and boulevards and around city buildings. The people demanded equality. They demanded to be treated like everyone else. They demanded to live and love as they pleased. They were proud. They had hope. They would make a difference. I ask for the movement to continue, for the movement to grow. More rainbow flags were made. Some were printed on bumper stickers and t-shirts. Others were hoisted onto lampposts on Halsted Street in Chicago. One was hung in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Soon, the rainbow flag was flying in other countries, like Brazil, England, Israel, Russia, Singapore, and Turkey. The rainbow flag now unfurled on farms, in suburbs, and in cities. The flag flew proudly outside public buildings, hotels, shops, restaurants, churches, and homes. And once, on June 26, 2015, the White House was awash in the colors of the rainbow flag. Equality, pride, hope, love. Harvey's dream became a flag for us all. Happy Banned Book Week! This book, Pride, is one of the most banned books of the past few years. Why do you think this book was banned?
Boy, are we creatures of habit. We're only singing it twice because we always only sing it twice. But if the music goes a third time, you're welcome to keep singing the kids out if you'd like to do that. Let's take a moment to gather ourselves. So I think just a week or two ago, I explained to you that the nature of my preaching tends to be introspectional and not informational, meaning that I invite us sometimes to return to material over and over again and to ponder it and to sort of, through a process of self-reflection, think about how the material might affect us so that we can become better scoundrels and have a better experience of living in our own skin. Well, today I'm going to be an informational preacher, not so introspective. And what I'm going to do is throw some information at you. For some of you, it will be very new, and for some of you, parts of it will be familiar, if not even redundant. But my aim here is actually not to hand you a sermon with a thesis statement that you can walk away from today. It's to begin a conversation, and I actually haven't quite yet determined how I'm going to help this conversation roll out throughout this year. Meredith and I actually talked about this the other day, and we have some ideas. But for now, I just want to put thoughts in your head for you to contemplate. I'm very hesitant to call this an additional developmental ministry goal because we've got enough of those. But in a way, it kind of is an additional developmental ministry goal because the conversation I'm going to ask us to have subsequent to this sermon over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 months is very important when it comes to the question of the culture we're developing here at First Church, what our identity is, and how we represent ourselves to the larger community. So I'm going to begin today by reading about a 5-minute reading from a gentleman named Daniel Burke. This reading comes from, I think it was the Washington Post was my source. I've had this on my hard drive for quite a while, and I'm returning to it today because I think it's still directly pertinent to Unitarian Universalism, even though it was written in 2011. Getting a little bit of feedback if you can hear that. So Daniel Burke wrote in 2011, "A recent Sunday service at the First Unitarian Church of Baltimore ended with an apology. A neo-pagan lay member who led the service feared that a reference to God in the hymn, 'Once to Every Soul and Nation,' might have upset the humanists in the pews. So she explained to the congregation that religious doctrine had been duly scrubbed from hymns in the Sunday program. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable by reciting something that might be considered a profession of faith," she said after the service. "Welcome to a typical Sunday in the Anything But Typical Unitarian Universalist Association, a liberal religious movement with a proud history of welcoming all seekers of truth, as long as truth is spelled with a lowercase t. Dramatic readings from the biography of 20th century labor leader John L. Lewis? Sure. An altar crowned with Christian, Buddhist, Islamic, and Jewish symbols? Absolutely. God talk? Well, for 50 years, the UUA has conducted a virtually unprecedented experiment, advancing a religion without doctrine and hoping that welcoming communities and shared political causes, not creeds, will draw people to its pews." That's an important part of the reading. I'll repeat it. For 50 years, the UUA has conducted a virtually unprecedented experiment, advancing a religion without doctrine and hoping that welcoming communities and shared political causes, not creeds, will draw people to its pews. Leaders say its no religious questions asked style positions the UUA to capitalize on liberalizing trends in American religion. But the UUA turns 50 this year, and some of its members say it's entering a midlife identity crisis. Trying to be all things to everyone is hampering outreach and hindering growth. Many UUA members say that they find meaning and purpose in the familial bonds forged in their congregations, regardless of religious beliefs. But some say the UUA is held back by members' reluctance to proclaim religious tenets. A tricky situation for an association that includes Christians, Buddhists, Jews, pagans, humanists, and spiritual refugees from a host of more dogmatic faiths. An internal UUA report from 2005 suggests that the whole association could go toes up if members continue to muffle religious discussion. The consensus of experts from an array of fields, from organizational development to systematic theology, is that to grow effectively, a religious organization needs clearly defined boundaries. So the report states. Like the UUA, 1 in 4 Americans sample from a variety of faith traditions, according to a 2009 survey by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. A separate Pew survey found that 65% believe that multiple religious paths can lead to eternal life. There has certainly been an increase in the amount of people who are open to the kind of ideas the Unitarian Universalists have championed, says John Green, a political scientist who worked on the Pew studies and has studied the UUA. Whether they can convert that into members joining them is an open question, but the opportunity is certainly there. So that's a long reading with a lot of grist for our thinking mills. But the gist of the reading, at least that I want to pull from today to lead you through an informational sermon, is that Unitarian Universalism has increasingly distanced itself from theology as a foregrounded aspect of who we are as a religious institution and congregations. And the lack of foregrounding theology has, I believe, been a detriment to us relative to our place in the larger cultural context. And that's kind of an argument I'm making this morning by selecting the kind of information I'm sharing with you. So I have a bias here. My bias is that Unitarian Universalism, because we're non-creedal, has actually, over the course of decades, removed itself from the cultural conversation around religion in America. So that's my thesis. And I'm not really arguing for it except implicitly this morning because I want to be careful and not to push the congregation as your developmental minister in a direction toward which I will not be here to steer the ship after my developmental ministry is done. So I have a bias, but I'm placing information in your laps so that as a congregation I can help you all have a conversation about this. And maybe at the end of the conversation, be a little bit more intentional about the theology that we here at First Church want to focus ourselves around and present to the immediate context in which we're situated and in which we do ministry. In other words, how do the people outside this church in the immediate vicinity view this church, theologically speaking? That's a really important question that almost no Unitarian Universalist church conscientiously discusses and answers. But if you want to grow a congregation, you better be thinking about what is the theological message we're sending to the people we're hoping are going to enter our doors and examine the possibility of them having a place in our religious organization. Isn't that a no-brainer? I think that's a no-brainer. So that's why this conversation is important. But we're going to begin, or our next phase, I would say, since I'm 7 minutes into it, is a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint is an exercise. Most of you are familiar with the exercise, one of these things is not like the other. So I have 4 slides, 3 of which is this exercise. But for those of you who may not be familiar with this exercise, we're going to do a couple of simple samples so that you get the gist. So Tim, if you would, just like show the first image, wait about 5 or 7 seconds, show the next image, etc. All right, we'll pause on that slide for a minute. You're laughing, so I think you got the gist of it. Which one of these things is not like the other? The desert is not like the other slides because they were water themed, right? All right, let's try one more time. Let's go to the next slide and do it again. Okay, which one of those things is not like the other? Number 2, the lizard with the top hat. Right, very good. So you get the gist. So here's the important one. One more time, we're going to move to slide 3, do it again, and see if you get it right this time. Okay, which one of those things is not like the other? The flying pig, number 5. Very good. So you get the gist of where I'm going this morning. All right, next slide. Now about that pig. What the heck is that?
Jet pig.
That's jet pig. That's, how many people here know jet pig? All right, well, most of you are going to be introduced to jet pig this morning. And the next slide, Tim. Jet pig is an acronym for the Unitarian Universalist Association's new values that were voted in at this year's General Assembly. Love is the central value, and around love you have justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. The acronym JETPIG. And so JETPIG is the way that the amorphous universe of Unitarian Universalism has decided would be the best mnemonic device for us to remember our new values. Now, what do these new values mean? Let's hold there for just a minute, Tim. So what happened in June of this year at our National General Assembly is that these values were voted in as Article 2 of the Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws. And when they were voted in, the bylaws then removed our principles, the 7 principles, and for some congregations 8, with which you are all probably familiar, and the sources that are listed beneath our principles. If you look on, like, I don't know, Roman italic page 10 or so at the very beginning of the hymnal, you'll see those 7 principles and the 6 sources that have been part of the UUA's bylaws since 1985. The original principles, there were 6 that were voted in 1961 when the Unitarians and the Universalists merged. So this is a big change for Unitarian Universalists. For 40 years almost, we have been very identified with the principles and the sources. But we're a living tradition. And so it's actually written into the bylaws, I think it is, or a policy of the UUA, that every so often the bylaws need to be revisited by a committee that decides if changes are necessary. And it was decided a few years ago that it's time to move away from the principles and sources toward a set of values. And so for the last 3 years, there's been a process at General Assembly which culminated this year in a very strong majority vote to make this change. Okay? So that's what JetPig is all about. It's a mnemonic device to remember the values that are now part of Article 2 of the association's bylaws. Okay? So that's a big part of the informational point this morning. Another part of the informational point is, for this conversation to have a context for you, I thought it would be good to go back and do a very brief, but kind of inadequate, history of Unitarian Universalist theology. So if we could do the next slide there, Tim. So I don't know if you all can read that. I can barely read it with my eyes. But on the left-hand side, at the top, it says Unitarian originated in Europe. And under that, it says the unity of God. At the time that Unitarianism emerged in Europe, Calvinism was dominant. And Calvinism taught the Trinity of God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And the Unitarians, who tended to be very rational-minded Congregationalist ministers, would read the Bible and they would say, we don't see any evidence for the Trinity in the Bible. We think the New Testament still espouses the notion that God is one, so God is a unity, not a Trinity. Well, this was a heretical statement in the day of John Calvin. And a lot of Unitarians who professed Unitarian theology were hereticized by the church. And some of them even put to death by being burned on crosses. Some of them had their houses burned down. Some of them had themselves physically punished in really egregious ways, all because they espoused Unitarian theology. So back in the day in Europe, if somebody called you a Unitarian walking down the street, you had to fear for your life. So to be a Unitarian back in the day was to be a heretic. But the name stuck, so the Unitarians are so named because of their theology of the unity of God, counter to the Trinity of God. Oh, need that back. On the right-hand side, Universalism also originated in Europe, and underneath that it says universal salvation. Again, John Calvin believed in predestination, which meant even before God created the earth, God predestined who would go to heaven and who would go to hell. And when the Universalists read the Bible, they read a Bible that espoused the unconditional love of God. And they said, the unconditional love of God is not consistent with a theology in which God would damn people to hell for eternity. So their interpretation of Christianity is when Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended back into heaven, he saved everybody through his death and resurrection, regardless of your theology, even including regardless whether or not you're a Christian. It was a universal salvation scheme that saved all humanity. And hence they were given the name Universalists, which, like the Unitarians, was a heretical label. Universalists were also fiercely persecuted at times for their theology. Well, why is this historical tour important? Well, both movements arrived in North America in the late 18th century after suffering this persecution in Europe. Unitarian theology was significantly influenced by the humanist movement here in America in the 1930s. In fact, 8 Unitarian ministers signed the first Humanist Manifesto. There have been 3 total. 8 Unitarian ministers signed the first Humanist Manifesto. So Unitarian theology in America remained largely Christian until the humanist movement. And over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 decades, Unitarianism became very identified with rational humanism. So it became a significant influence in Unitarian circles. Universalist theology, however, remained largely unchanged after coming to America. So, about 1961, there was a merger. I shouldn't say about 1961. Around 1961, both movements found themselves dwindling in numbers and becoming culturally irrelevant, mostly because they were too liberal for the Christian cultural context in which the Unitarians and the Universalists were situated in America. They basically, because of their gross theological liberalism, and I don't mean gross in a bad way, I mean in a large way, ended up becoming alienated from the culture at large. People in the culture at large, for the most part, couldn't relate to the theologies of the Unitarians and the Universalists. So both movements were dwindling significantly. And so the merger that happened in 1961 was a wedding of convenience between two liberal Christian movements in America. Now, because of the persecution that both branches of our tree experienced in Europe, but also here in America, when the merger happened in 1961, they were very intentional about being a non-creedal association. So if you were to go home on Sunday afternoon and read the 34 pages of the UUA's bylaws, which I know most of you are going to do following this sermon, you will see in there that it is explicitly stated that no creedal test shall be applied to a member of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Okay? So, what does that mean? Largely because of the influence of the humanists, but also because of the advent of science and technology, historical understanding, biblical criticism, a number of factors came into play in which the Unitarian Universalists, now after 1961, found themselves drifting further and further and further away from any kind of creedal theology. So when you abandon creed, you lose the linguistic or semantic identity by which you can say, this is what makes me a Unitarian Universalist. And so people were struggling with, well, if we don't have a creed, how do I explain what a Unitarian Universalist is to people? It was a real struggle. So when they merged in 1961, they thought, we're going to try and head this off at the pass, and they developed 6 principles, which were revisited in the early 80s, and in 1985 they were expanded to the 7 principles now in the hymnal, and the 6 sources also in our hymnal. And that became, for the most part, not a creed, but a set of principles and sources that we could point to say, this is what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. These are the sources from which we draw. They're all the world's religions, including philosophies, whether spiritual or rational humanist, and the scientific method. We draw from all these sources of wisdom, and we give each other the right. We covenant together, so each of us has the right to pursue our spiritual or philosophical lives as we see fit based on our sources. Okay? So that's what it meant to be a Unitarian Universalist by and large. But you have to remember, they're principles, not a creed. Okay? So actually, it wasn't incumbent on anybody to actually affirm the principles and sources, because that would be a creedal test. But by and large, as a movement, Unitarian Universalists have for the last 40 years. This has been very significant for us, because it was a very intentional, conscientious choice not to be a creedal religious body. And for those of us sitting in the pews, we're like, yeah, and there's good reason for that, right? We've had enough of creed. We've had enough of persecution. We want our religious freedom. But there's a publicity problem that comes with that. People who are not part of the Unitarian Universalist Association, or even more immediately in the context in which any UU congregation finds itself, have a really hard time wrapping their minds around. How can you be a religion? You don't even have a creed. You don't even have a statement of faith. Well, we do have these principles, and we've covenanted together, and if you'll listen to me for 3 hours, you might begin to get a sense of what a Unitarian Universalist is. And so while this is very important to us who are already in the club, we don't get a whole lot of bandwidth in the culture at large. It's been a publicity problem, and it's part of why the gentleman who wrote the 5-minute reading I did at the beginning wrote the 5-minute reading I did at the beginning. He was flagging that it's very hard to be a religious institution and grow and thrive when you don't have a creed, and your greatest claim to fame is liberal social justice alone. I'm not knocking liberal social justice. It's really important. But what he was flagging in the reading is, but if that's the only song you sing, and you're not offering people some kind of theological context also for a spiritual journey, you're going to be talking to an incredibly narrow demographic of the culture. So don't be surprised if you struggle to grow. Okay? But at least we had an identity, the principles and the purposes. But it removed us, by and large, from the larger cultural context, from the religious conversation in the culture, and made publicity and growth a problem for us. That's my take. Now, fast forward to this year, and if we can go back, in 2024, June of this year, we adopted the values, JetPig. Okay? So, I'm long in the tooth. I love the principles, and I love the sources. But I've been doing this 32 or 3 years now, and I realize, from the perspective of most of my colleagues, most of whom are younger than me, and the new generation that is arising within Unitarian Universalism as a living tradition and has other ideas of who and what we are and what we need to be in the world, I realize I'm kind of in the minority, and that's okay. Change happens. But I do want to say that as the principles removed us from the religious conversation at large in the culture, my concern is, now when I say things like this, people say, Alex doesn't like the UUA. No, it's not true. I love the UUA. I'm kind of an internal critic at times, though, and this is one of those times. My concern is espousing 7 words as the values of our association moves us even further from the ability to define ourselves in a uniquely religious way to the culture at large. I think they're great values. I agree with all of them. But really, if you were to take those values and go to almost any religious organization in America, and really, probably almost any political organization in America, you would get almost universal affirmation that those values are values they hold. They may interpret them somewhat differently than we do, but most people would espouse the same values. So we lose even more of our ability to articulate what distinguishes us as a religious institution. So I think we're increasing our publicity problem based on a drift away from meaningful, is articulable a word? Theological understandings by which we can define ourselves and convey that message to the culture at large. So even though the reading was in 2011, I think he's got a point. I think we've learned the hard way, decade after decade after decade, that if you want to survive, and not just survive, but thrive as a religious institution in an America where religious institutions are dwindling on a decadal basis, you better have some identity that you can articulate to the culture at large. Because when you talk to somebody who's not a UU yet, what you're trying to say to them is spend your time, spend your energy, and spend some of your money supporting our religious institution. Come join us. And it's worth it for you because JetPig.
That's right. For me, anyway.
Well, see, you're already part of the crowd. It's right for you because you're part of the crowd.
And I talk to the others.
So here's where I want to take our conversation that I'm going to pursue following today. I want us to think about this topic from the perspective of PR. From the perspective of publicity. Every Unitarian Universalist congregation I've served and every other one I've observed is loath to be conscientious about the theological conversation, about what defines them as a congregation. We are far more comfortable saying, we're very happy not having a creed. In fact, a lot of us are walking wounded from our religious past, and we like an oasis where we don't have to think about that stuff. So what I think a lot of us are doing is, in the name of theological freedom, running away from our past or avoiding theologies that chagrin us in the name of theological freedom, but not pursuing theology anymore. We're hiding theologically, spiritually, under the guise of theological and spiritual freedom. But we're not at all being conscientious about what now defines us theologically as a group. So, boy, am I off script. I got a bunch of bullet points here that I ain't following. So, another way to say what I'd like us to think about is this. So when ministers go into search, they fill out a sheet called their ministerial record sheet, which is the history of their ministry, what is their philosophy of ministry, what is their theology, what is their participation in social justice, just a whole host of things. It's not really a sheet, it's almost a book. And congregations do the same thing. You fill out a congregational record sheet. And ministers and congregations who are both in search exchange these materials with each other. In my ministerial record sheet, I wrote the following. Churches, like all businesses, also sell widgets to stay in business. That is, to attract and retain members. Ford sells cars. Dell sells computers. What widgets do churches sell? Now, if that's a strange question to you, it kind of proves my point. We are also a business. We're selling things. And we're not being very conscientious about what the heck it is we're selling. So what do we sell? Well, for starters, churches must have a meaningful Sunday morning service, a lively children's religious education program, a compelling adult religious education program, a visible social justice presence in the community, and a functional membership committee that tracks and follows up with visitors. This is more the administrative side of the business, but very important. These are the types of widgets churches sell. It's really not terribly complicated. But implementation is often fuzzy, which is why so many of our congregations struggle to grow. So that's the perspective I'm asking you to look through when you consider the information I'm sharing this morning. I'm asking you to consider theology from the point of view of not only what is meaningful to those of us already in the club, but more importantly, how does the way we articulate our theology going to draw more people to our club? Because people who aren't Unitarian Universalists yet, when they go around looking for a good liberal church, they're wondering, what do you all believe? Who are you all? Right? So it's very important to us, if we want to survive, and not just survive, but thrive as a religious institution here in Cincinnati, that we be conscientious about our theological identity. And we take some effort after we discern this as a group, to articulate that to the community at large. So that when people look at First Church from outside of these walls, they have a pretty easy understanding of what it is we believe. I don't think that's really obvious to people who aren't already in the club. Either here at First Church, or up at St. John's, or over at Heritage, or in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, or in New York, or in LA, California. But it's an important question. So that's the invitation I'm giving you. And I'm going to be following up with this for opportunities for conversation. I want to encourage you, but first I have to ask you, do you even want to have this conversation?
Oh, yes.
Then I want to encourage us as a group, an amorphous process so far, but as a group throughout the year, to have some time for discerning how we will articulate our theology and or philosophy together. And then begin to have conversations with the board and the communications team. And is communications a subset of publicity? I'll call it a subset of publicity in-house, all right? And maybe the formation of a publicity committee so that we can begin to articulate in a very conscientious, visible, and clear way who we are as a congregation to those outside of our walls who might want to know. All right. How's that for informational preaching? That's a lot of stuff, okay? All right, so our last hymn this morning is 291, Die Gedanken sind frei, which means thoughts are free. All right, y'all. Congregational meeting in about 25 minutes, so a short coffee hour. To expedite the coffee hour, I'm not going to do a receiving line today so that we can get moving. And I don't know, we'll ring the bell or whatever when it's time for you to re-enter for the congregational meeting. I hope you can stay. It looks like a relatively short meeting. We'll end our service this morning with these words. Go out into the highways and the byways. Give the people something of your new vision. You got to know what it is if you're going to give it to people. Go out into the highways and byways and give people something of your new vision. You may possess a small light, but uncover it. Let it shine. Use it in order to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of men and women. Give them not hell, but hope and courage, and preach the kindness and everlasting love of God. Namaste, my friends.